Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of One Hale of a Conversation. The current title of this podcast. I am James Hale. I am the executive director of Mad Company and your host at the moment for this podcast. With me today in the studio is the inimitable Max Brand.
Oh, thank you. One Hale of a podcast.
Wonderful, man.
I love that name, and I love that person.
Thank you.
I'm going to make you redo it.
I might record another one.
It's terrifying.
And then left it behind. Retired.
Right, and we're back after that exciting interruption. What next season will hold? My name is James Hale. We're very excited to have you here today. I've got lots of questions, so we're just going to dive right in.
Sounds great.
First up, I'm wondering, I've done all my homework, I promise, but
Sure.
you are an actor, a writer, a comic, an assistant director. Are there any other titles that we need to add so that everyone is aware of your talents?
I would say producer. I think because I've produced a
Producer,
decent
okay.
amount of things. So yeah,
Okay.
I think that's probably the scope of my current bag of tricks. All of which I don't know if I had ambition for, but they were necessary to continue to perform. But
Sure.
yes, continue.
Right, you had to do them.
Yeah.
Not necessarily desire to.
Yeah.
Excellent. So you are from, I guess, Colorado. It's a little bit difficult to tell from your bio. Many places, but we'll call it Colorado. I wonder if you can just, in your own words, sort of trace your journey from Colorado to New York City to becoming the treasurer for what I keep hearing is the most exciting young theater company in the world.
Yeah, frankly, I hear the same thing. Every deli I go into, people are talking about it on the street. They're going crazy for it. I think it's road rage, but it's just someone stopping to talk to me about Mad Company. It's really great.
Yeah.
So for my journey, for those of you who don't know anything about me, I was born in Montana, and then we moved around the world for my dad's job, but we always came back to Colorado. And so for the journey from Colorado to New York, it was mainly about school. I've wanted to be an actor since I was about 4 years old.
Oh, wow.
And so I always wanted to, my original plan was to move out to L.A., live out of my car, and make money strumming my guitar on the streets, and then audition during the day.
Absolutely. The dream.
Yeah. I mean, it's so romantic and wonderful and very realistic. Looking back, it's just perfectly realistic. But I went to a thespian convention in high school, and I was taught a workshop by someone for what was known at that point as the School for Film and Television.
Okay.
And that school was based in New York City. So I was like, I'm looking into the school. And that, since it was based in New York, it kind of brought me out here. So,
Okay. So I didn't realize that. You actually came for school.
Yeah, I came it was a 2-year school because originally the plan was to be famous by 22.
Yep.
So I had to get
Funnily
out
enough,
there.
that was my plan as well.
Yeah. I think, it makes sense.
Yes.
It's once again realistic
Yep.
and anchored in reality for most of us. And that was my plan. That kind of brought me out here. And then I've just more or less stayed here for 16 years.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
16 years. All right, that answers a follow-up because you of our group, I think, have been here the longest, other than maybe a couple people who are from Long Island, New York. But you, as a transplant, have certainly spent the most time in the city, which is interesting, and I will follow up on that. Interesting. So you came here specifically for this 2-year program. Also, all over your bio and your resume is UCB. When did you start? When did you become an upright citizen? How did that happen?
I started taking classes there in 2009, I think was my first class. So I got out of school for the School for Film and Television.
Mm-hmm.
I was auditioning, and then I ended up taking a workshop from a commercial agent. And they told me that if I wanted to get hired in commercials, I should take classes at UCB.
Okay.
And so I went to a show there. And I would say this was sort of the height of what UCB was at that point. If you don't know what UCB, it's called the Upright Citizens Brigade. It's a theater started by Amy Poehler, Matt Walsh, Ian Roberts, and Matt Besser, who are all famous in their own right. But they came out of Chicago and they started an improv school here and a theater first and then a school. And I just thought it was amazing. And so I just kind of got hooked and taking classes. And I will say that I didn't really feel part of the community. I wouldn't say I was a upright citizen, as you put it, which I love.
They don't have a badge or anything.
Right. We did get sweatshirts, which
Oh.
I never really wore when I was performing there. But then once it kind of all fell apart in the pandemic, I felt like I wanted to wear it more.
There you go. Solidarity.
Yeah, but I think it was one of those things where it was a very like any place, there was an in crowd and the people who weren't quite part of it yet, and I always felt very much on the outside of that. And then I was put on teams there, and I slowly felt more like I was part of it, but still a little bit on the outside. And but as it continued, I met more and more people that I got close to. I think when you start anything initially, it's like, nobody here likes me. I don't,
Right.
I don't really work with anybody.
Right. I am the outsider.
Yeah, and then slowly you meet the people that you're like, oh, you're actually way cooler than I thought, or, you're not like a total asshole. And,
Right. Right. The ignorance of first impressions.
Yeah, so I think, so I was there for quite a long time on a sketch team, and I did improv periodically, but I was primarily there as a sketch performer, and I hosted shows, and I think what I loved about it was that we were performing for free, but
Right.
it was like we could kind of, by the end especially of my time there, I think I really felt like, me and my friends could do what we wanted to do on stage.
Sure.
And that was really fun. And whether it was midnight or not, it was kind of like, oh, I have this opportunity to just perform in
Right.
New York City, and that was really exciting.
Right. And can be rare when you're not doing it. You don't realize sort of how frequently you're not performing.
Right.
So this is interesting. This is something I don't really understand that well about the comedy scene. What specifically are the differences between a sketch show and an improv show? Because in my head, I would show up to either of them and assume it was the same thing.
Sure. Hopefully, first of all, they're both funny. That's
Okay.
hopefully they'll
Job
both.
one.
Yeah. Hopefully, that's their similarities for sure. Is they're both probably intended to make you laugh. An improv show basically is they would get a suggestion from the audience and make everything up on the spot.
Okay.
So there are various forms of that, but that would be kind of the basic premise. And then
Okay.
a sketch show would be more like Saturday Night Live, where they've written all the sketches, they've rehearsed the sketches, and that's like generally a half hour in UCB would be like a whole sketch show, but it would be sometimes with a theme, sometimes without a theme, but it would be a bunch of individual sketches with actors.
Interesting.
And
So
yeah.
so these are like written and rehearsed ahead of time. It's not
Yeah.
an improvised scenario.
Right.
Okay. Oh. Important distinction that I come on this podcast to learn things.
Hey, there
That's
you
why
go.
that's why I do this. So you are at UCB, you're at the School of Film and Television, you're breaking into New York, you're taking the city by storm. You decide to eventually leave to go to London.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, it was actually funny. They sort of intermixed because I was performing a lot at UCB. So I was, generally probably about 2 times a week on average. And one of my shows, UCB also had theaters in LA. And they still have theaters in LA. So we took one of our shows that was pretty successful in New York City, and I was a performer on it. A friend of mine wrote it. It was a great show. We took it to LA for a couple of performances. And fellow Mad Company board member Lauren Zabilski lived out in LA, and Lauren and I went to high school together. And so I was like, hey, you want to grab a drink? Just say hey, like catch up. And so I met up with her and her sister, and she just had let me know that she was applying for a bunch of master's programs, and she mentioned a bunch of schools, and one of them was Lambda. And I had thought about applying for going back to school, but I never received a bachelor's degree.
Right.
And so I was sort of limited in my options. And so I couldn't apply to any schools in the U.S. But then I looked at Lambda's website, and they were like, they would take
They don't
professional.
care.
Well, I maybe that's true. I mean, I got in, so maybe that's true. But they put on their thing that they would allow for professional experience over a bachelor's degree.
Okay.
So I basically sent them my resume and my TV credits, my film credits, and like things like this that I'd done throughout the years, which none of which are super impressive, but they're there. They are physically.
exist. Yeah.
I did do things that showed up on certain platforms, and so I kind of sent that their way, and they were like, "Yeah, this works for us." So I applied just to Lambda. That was the only school I ever applied for.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and I was like, if it doesn't happen, I'm still performing and I'm
Right.
still like, growing my career. But I felt like Lambda would be. I always wanted to study Shakespeare because I was never that good at it, and I was kind of intimidated by it. And I was like, well, I think that's like real actors know how to do Shakespeare. And so I applied, and I worked with one of my acting coaches for a monologue. And I did it, and I was like, if that doesn't work, I just go back to doing comedy and my stuff
Right.
that I'm already
Try a
doing.
thing.
Right. And then I ended up getting in. So I was like, all right, let's do this. And yeah, so
That's amazing.
yeah.
Just kind of happens. Why? So you wanted to study Shakespeare because mostly some real actors do Shakespeare. What was you said you wanted to be an actor since age 4? Like,
Yep.
what was the impetus for that? What were you seeing that made you want to suddenly become an actor?
I think it was the idea that I loved playing pretend in the woods, and I would do that by myself all the time, especially because we moved around so much as a kid.
Sure.
I mean, by 4, I was still very young, obviously, but I remember watching. I always watched movies, especially, and it was like, oh, as a grown up, you can just play pretend, and it always was very exciting. So I think that's what it always was for me. It was like, oh, I can just live all my fantasies that I'm doing on my own in the woods, but I can do that for money.
Forever.
Yeah,
For
forever.
money.
And well, at least I thought it was for money. The last 16 years have proved
Prove otherwise.
periodically for money, but often not. Yeah.
Sure. That's pretty self-aware for a 4-year-old. I feel like as a child, I watched whatever it was and always wanted to be the things the actors were portraying, not the actors themselves. So it's impressive that you realize that these people were just pretending up there.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it was. I'm not sure. I mean, my mom told me, right? Like, I don't have vivid memories from being 4 years old. So my mom was like, she told me that I've been talking about it since I was 4 years old. So
Right.
it's possible she lied. She could be just a straight up liar, and I never said anything about acting until I was 10 or something. But yeah, I think it was mainly that I was like, I would see, I'd see these people on the box doing the exciting things, and
Right.
be like, who are these people? And my mom would be like, those are actors.
Those are actors.
And I was like,
Ah.
oh, well, that
That's the
sounds
thing.
fun. They can be in space. They can be underwater, whatever, Yeah.
Really just all derives from you wanting to be in space and underwater.
Maybe that's it. That could be
That's the height of it.
the entire reason I'm doing this. Yes.
So, in New York, 16 plus years, acting, doing comedy, living life. I'm curious how do you think you've done finding balance between making art, making money, having a life and friends, and what are some of the things that you've learned or some of the ideals that you strive for in order to make that balance happen?
Ooh, big question, James.
We dig deep here at one
right,
hell of a conversation.
Right? Yeah, hell yeah. Hail yeah. Well, I would say that I have loosened my grip on what should happen as a actor, artist in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
When I first got here, I think I had very harsh judgments for anybody with any sort of day job that would take over their life, ostensibly. Because I was like, you have to be available for every audition. That's what was drilled into me for a long, long time. Right. And it was like, if you say no to one thing, then you're going to be blacklisted and no one's going to want to work with you and all this kind of thing. And so I did that in my early 20s. And it was wonderful because I was in New York and I was doing new things.
Sure.
It was also a little bit of hell because I just really hated most jobs I had. the good part about it was they were all like stressful in the moment, but then I went home and there was nothing to worry
Right.
about. It was like, yeah, it was a catering event that absolutely does not matter anymore, you know?
Okay.
So that was nice, but I was just like physically exhausted. I'm a person who likes to get up early and go to bed early, and
Sure.
I was working all these jobs that I was up till 2 a.m., 3 a.m. And so anyway, I think when I started doing things at UCB, I started kind of working with writers that had like regular day jobs and then would write sketches at night, and then some of them would kind of end up being actors, and they never had to do like a bad restaurant job or something like that.
Right.
Not to say that like there's really good restaurant jobs too. I had a decent amount of bad ones. But
Not to knock the restaurant industry.
yes, exactly. We love the restaurant industry. I love to frequent your establishments. But I think I realized I was like, oh, I don't have to do what like all the plays and all the movies say that actors have to do.
Right.
And
Right. The broke artist.
right.
Yeah.
And so I ended up through UCB. I actually ended up being a tour guide as a day job, and then I sort of cobbled together. I worked with dogs for a while, so for a while I was a tour guide and a dog walker, and then I would, because I was making friends and connections and people that were producing things in the comedy world, I would be hired as an actor for a lot of projects that ended up going online. But also there were like very small things for like a TV show and all these kind of things that cropped up through people I knew at UCB.
Sure.
And so I was able to kind of, definitely before the pandemic, before going to Lambda, I was able to sort of cobble together a life for myself of about 3 or 4 different day jobs with acting jobs.
Sure.
And I was proud of myself because I was like, well, I'm not in the red.
Yeah,
like, I'm
you're
not,
making it work.
Right, I'm making it work, but it wasn't growth oriented. It wasn't like, oh, in 5 years this is going to be still great.
Right.
It was very,
Right.
and that's one of the
Not
reasons.
sustainable.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to go to Lambda was because I wanted to get back to the art, but I also, frankly, wanted to set myself up in a position that might help me make more money as an artist. And having a master's degree is very helpful.
Yes.
And for many reasons, but even if I wanted to do something else, like regular job-wise, I think I wanted to go back to school for that reason and have a master's degree on my resume. But yeah, so before I went to Lambda, I think it was very much a cobble it all together. And you know, my now wife, but I was dating her, and she and I kind of had similar lifestyles. We didn't have a dog, which we have now. We love our dog. But it's like we didn't have a lot of things, and so we were each periodically up till like 1 a.m. various nights.
Sure.
And just tired. So, for me, it's like now what I tell everybody is like do what makes you feel best. And then you will have opportunities for art no matter what.
Right.
But if you are feeling good about yourself and you need a job that you can do auditions,
Right.
But
If you can't do art, then you can't do art. But
right. But I think, most day jobs, especially now in this environment where things are remote, it's like people that aren't artists get off for like hours for doctor's appointments or whatever. And it's like, if you get your work done,
Right.
you can make it work. So it's like, do what you like. Do what makes you not miserable. And then you'll be able to, at least my opinion is, you'll be able to probably deal with the artistic lifestyle a little bit better.
I would agree with that. I mean, that seems wise. Don't be miserable.
Yeah.
So having sort of come to that, gone through like maybe the typical artist life to where you are now, what does success look like to you, or how would you define success for yourself, either as an artist or just in life?
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of a question I think I grapple with every day.
Sure.
Right now, I think my version of success is balance in both my life and as an artist. If you have balance, you're usually pretty okay in the sense that you're going to have moments that are like incredible and really exciting and all of that. and then you're going to have moments that are like really terrible and you just hate everything. But if you can always sort of come back to an equilibrium at the end of each of those days, then I think you're in a good spot. So in my mind, like success would be, I mean, monetarily, it would be making my money for my life as an artist.
Sure.
That would definitely be a version of success that I don't think I definitely have not achieved as of now. I make a certain amount of money doing it, but it's not like this is the only thing I'm doing. But also success on that sort of same train of thought is not having to worry whether I can afford my apartment at the end of the month. So therefore, I have a day job.
Right.
And that is a version of success, is like I am secure in that, so that I'm not, every night pulling my non-existent hair out. But I'm a bald man, in case you are not watching
You're
this.
right. In case this is audio only.
But yeah, I think it's a lot of that feeling, which is like, what are your priorities?
Right.
And how can you be an artist in those priorities? So for me, it's like the art I make is incredibly important to who I am as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to create that art, I need to know that I have a place to sleep.
Right. A modicum of stability.
Right. So I think that's, I think that answers that. Is like, I need stability for myself to be an artist. Right. I also cannot only have stability because being an artist is pretty crazy and wild and wonderful, but everything.
Right.
And so I can't just have stability. I couldn't live that kind of life, but I also can't have
some mix of stability and freedom for artistic creativity.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. That feels like a noble thing to strive for sure.
Yeah, we're all striving.
We're all striving.
We'll see if any of us get there. Yeah.
We strive. So you've found this balance for yourself as an artist. You have an idea of what success looks like, something to strive for. I do not consider myself a comedian by any means, and so I'm curious about sort of the creation of material as a comic, specifically as someone who writes your own stuff. So, two-part question: A, where do you find thoughts, ideas, the impetus for whatever eventual product you create, and how do you go about turning that idea, whatever it is, into a joke, a sketch, a character? How does that come about?
Cool. Yeah. It's funny because I think comedy is not for everybody, but at least for me, is similar to acting in the sense where it's like, if you have any one-off conversation with me, I'm not going to be the funniest guy you've ever talked to. In general, I don't
sell yourself short.
Thank you. But but I think it's, I don't really put that on myself generally day to day. I think there are comedians that do and are brilliant. You'll meet them and you're just like, this is the funniest guy I've ever talked to. And they're a brilliant comedian as well. It's just like, man. For me, it's, I think I have to work for it. But I find generally the original feeling for it incredibly fun. And the work is generally like honing down the idea to explain the thing that made me laugh in my head to an audience.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so it's like, I guess, a lot of my ideas come from extremity of emotions or feelings. So something that really makes me mad will often help me come up with a joke about it, because if I just start writing all the ways it makes me mad, then, I can see how ridiculous it is that I'm mad at that, or how stupid I am for being mad at that.
Okay.
Or, something like that. Or how absolutely righteous I am in being absolutely like, this is the truth and all of that. And I think how it is, I have the most experience writing characters, like something you may see on Saturday Night Live or something.
Sure.
Like a monologue with jokes all the way through it. So they have a very specific voice and a very specific point of view. So sometimes that just comes out of me. Like James and I did the scene for our final scenes for Lambda.
Our showcase.
Our showcase, which was, about one of our characters accusing the other character of being a sink pisser. And that all stemmed from me going to the bathroom in my apartment. Nobody freak out. But I went in my apartment, and I just looked at my sink, and I'm tall, and I was like, I could just piss in my sink.
The right height, right.
Yeah, and I'm like, that would be weird. And then I made like a voice of like, sink pisser, and that's how it like just came out of it. And it was just fun for me to do that voice, and it was fun for me to write that because I was like, who is this person who loves pissing in sinks, or is and what ended up being the case was ashamed of being of pissing in sinks,
right.
And
the dark secret,
right, and ended up being that he was from a lower class upbringing where they didn't have toilets, and it was very silly, but it's like based in the reality of sort of I guess how the world works, which is like when you grow up a certain way and then you interact with other people and they say like that's not how things are done.
Your normalized behavior is not normal.
Right, and I think like I have a lot of that, especially with moving around. There was a lot of times in my life where something that I thought was normal in my family or in my country for that matter when I lived internationally was like made fun of by my peers, and not like in a terrible way, but like when I lived in Singapore, they called a cell phone a hand phone, and which makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But when I called it a cell phone, everybody made fun of me. So it was like kind of that learning curve of like, oh, they just call it something different, in the same way that Americans would make fun of me if I called it a hand phone.
Right.
So, so anyway, it was just, it's one of those things that I'm fascinated by. And within the last 3 or 2 years, I've been doing more stand-up. And I think those kind of come out of, I think, mostly poking fun at myself, and the same thing, which is like things that frustrate me or whatever, but there's a lot about stand-up that's calling out your own appearance and calling out what people see because that's who's on stage.
Right.
And so it's a lot about me like analyzing what I look like and what I think is weird or what I think is actually really good, but people have told me is weird.
People, right.
And then the audience can sort of have fun, hopefully, with the idea of like, yeah, I do see what other people are seeing. Yeah, and this guy's crazy for thinking that, But yeah, so I think that more or less answers it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as you move more into stand-up, do you feel like you come from this place of writing mostly characters and then evolving that into comedy? Do you feel as a stand-up that you're playing a caricature of yourself on stage, or are you just up there telling jokes about yourself ostensibly?
Yeah, I think everything is. I think all stand-up comedy is a little bit of a character.
Sure.
Like I said, there are maybe people that are completely themselves doing stand-up comedy, but I'm not sure that's even true because it's always going to be a distilled version,
right?
And you are there to make people laugh. So it's like me in my regular life, I'm not existing in the world to make everybody around me laugh. So
all evidence to the contrary. But.
Well, thank you. But it is like, I'm just kind of existing in the world, and ridiculous things may happen or may not happen. But I think for stand-up, it's like I have 5 minutes, and I'm trying to tell you in the most concise way possible the reason why I think this situation is funny, or I am funny,
right.
Or like look at this thing that's dumb about me, or
right,
whatever.
And the purpose of my being here is for one specific event.
Yes.
Interesting. That's really interesting, and I'm fascinated. So your comedy comes from the extremities of emotion, which is really interesting to me, and I clue in on that because that's one of the things at Lambda we talked about a lot, especially with Shakespeare, is that all of these plays in the canon deal with the absolute most in human behavior at whatever end of the spectrum. It has to be literal life and death. It has to be you will spend the rest of your life and be wonderfully happy, or you will not spend the rest of your life and be tremendously sad. And so it's interesting that sort of what I think of as, and I would say a lot of people think of as sort of the height of drama, is in fact also the essence of the comedy that you create.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think because to me, it's like, even if my jokes are not particularly full of emotion or anything like that, some of them I think have like sort of a character aspect to them. But I think like if you're rehearsing, like if anybody who's like rehearsing a Shakespeare show, I think most of the time throughout the rehearsal process, there will usually be a point, like if you're doing, we just did Romeo and Juliet, and, you can laugh about the fact of like, you can say like, oh, Friar Lawrence, like, if you just would have delivered that thing yourself, or something like that, you can sort of laugh at like the fact that so many things could have been solved if one person would have just done something slightly, or like, Romeo, it's like, if you just would just chill.
Right.
If you just didn't kill yourself right then,
Wait 1 literal minute.
Right. And it's like, so I find that like a lot of times for stand-up or for sketches or whatever, it's like that juxtaposition of like, if I have a crazy experience with someone, like one of my jokes is all about, based on what my family has told me about living in New York, and how my family is like, I could never live in New York,
right.
And like, and they do say it that dramatically, and they do say it with that much like disgust for
right.
living in the city or whatever. And so for me, it's like, I make fun of that because I'm like, yeah, like it's not that hard.
Right. Why such a visceral reaction?
Yeah, exactly. So I think like that is sort of the extremity of emotion, but it's sort of calling out that it's ridiculous to have that extremity of an emotion about just a place to live.
Right.
And,
Right. 10 million people live here. Like, we're not all crazy.
And like, I think, yeah, and we like living here. Like, it's expensive for a reason. Like,
right.
So I don't know. So I think like that's part of what I talk about, I think, with dealing in extremes. Yeah.
Sure. So we did just come out of Romeo and Juliet about a month ago. You were the assistant director. You also ran the show every night, virtually by yourself, which is an incredible feat. That was a relatively new experience for you. Yeah, I mean, you had run aspects of shows before, and I think you've directed some of your own. I mean, certainly direct your own comedy, but you've directed some sort of theatrical fare. How was Romeo and Juliet? How was the scale of the show? And how was working with Hannah in particular?
Yeah, I mean, the scale was probably the most intense thing. I definitely worked on projects of this scale or even more, but as an actor or an extra or something like
sure.
that. That's like such smaller and less stakes. This was a wild experience that I wouldn't take back for the world, because it was incredibly informative.
Sure.
And I learned so much. I learned so much from Hannah. I'm only thankful to her for letting me be by her side throughout that whole process, because I just was like amazed.
Sure. This is Hannah Idenau, our director, who we brought over from London for this show.
Yeah, I mean, she's amazing at what she does, so it was really great to just have a little bit of a window into her thought processes. I mean, first of all, everybody knows this, but a director deals with so much.
Sure.
And as an actor, I don't think there is sufficient, unless you like have been on the other side, I'm not sure actors have sufficient scale of what they are dealing with theatrical performances, like large scale theatrical performances, and films. But I think films people understand a little bit more, because
we talk about the auteur in film much more than we do about the director of even a Broadway show.
Right. Yeah. And with film, you see them behind the camera, and you see them talking with the sound person or the director of photography or whoever it is. And with stage stuff, I think the actors come in for rehearsal, which they may or may not realize, like, you know, the months that they've been talking about this project beforehand, and then the meetings that are happening after rehearsal, and the meetings that are happening before rehearsal, and the text messages that are like, you know, with what is happening with this. And so it's just the scale of the things that she was keeping in her mind was incredible. And the fact that she was able to, on top of all that, have individual conversations with actors about, you know, motivation, or, you know, moving from this side of the stage to that side of the stage, or why would I do this, or, you know, should we play with this moment, or however it is. I found myself amazed, because I have directed, you know, much smaller things. I directed a short film and things like that, but it was smaller, and it was a shorter script, and there was less things to think about. And once the lighting had been figured out, and once the director of photography was like, this is what we're going to do, it was like, great, now I can just concentrate. And for Hannah, I just was amazed, because she was able to remember what she said to an actor beforehand, continue that conversation, and then turn to me and be like, hey, we're going to need to schedule, like, you know, 2 extra hours at some point for us to go over what we just talked about with this actor. And on top of that, we need to think about the lighting, because there are, you know, 8 actors on stage instead of 6, or whatever it was. And then the sound cues, and, you know, there's all of that in her head at all times, because everybody's coming to her. And I was amazed. Wow. And I think as the assistant director, and I think I was initially kind of, because I'd never done it before, I was like, okay, what am I, like, what is my role?
What is this job? Sure.
Yeah, and like, and then I think we ended up probably doing something that wasn't, probably wouldn't be defined as the assistant director role, but I think, but was very, I felt, what was nice is I felt very useful, and I felt very like I was helping the production, and I was able to connect with Hannah, and, you know, I would pitch certain ideas that she would say, absolutely not. And I was able to be, and what was so nice about that, honestly, was that, like, I knew that it felt to me, and you'd have to talk to her if this is true, but, you know, it felt to me like she had respect enough for me to not just be like, oh, nice. Okay, we'll think about that.
Right.
You know, it was like, no, that's a bad idea. So that when I pitched something that was a decent idea, she was like, oh, you know what? That's actually good. Let's talk to the actors about that, or let's figure out how we can make that work. And there were a lot more rejections than positive things, but I think it was really good, and it was really nice, because I was like, oh, cool. So I know the scale now. Like, I know why something is being rejected. I know why something is being accepted. And it helps my brain sort of, if I were to ever direct something in the future, which I would love to do, it's like, it helps my brain go like, oh, this is what's helpful, and this is what's just something that you may want but doesn't need to happen.
Sure.
Yeah, so that was
an idea that's fun and useful, but maybe not the most useful or the most necessary.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. So you would like to direct? Is that something that you envision for yourself in the future?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it would be wonderful. I think it would be, and once again, it's like so much about the team of everybody around you, especially. But I do think it's like, it's a wonderful process. And I think the director is truly able to take a step back, and Hannah is incredible at it, of just seeing what the show needs.
Right.
And, you know, I would see throughout the rehearsal process, you know, the same process that I was having with Hannah as the assistant director, I would see actors go through with Hannah for what
their individual character, maybe
for their process, and in the sense that, like, you know, actors have a bunch of ideas all the time that a lot of times are like wonderful, and I mean, all ideas are wonderful, but it's like there were certain ideas that would be pitched at certain times that was like, that doesn't help the show.
Right.
And it's not that it's a bad idea. It's just like that's not helpful to what we're doing. And I was able to sort of like see some of that at certain times, and that was very helpful for me because I could see, because I was behind the table, being like, oh, why is that happening? That makes no sense.
Contextualize these ideas.
Right. In the world that we're creating, this doesn't work. And so it's very interesting. And it was also very interesting of certain ideas that, like, in a rehearsal, like an actor would try something, and my first impulse often would be like, oh, that doesn't seem to work at all. Not as like a judgment, but just like that doesn't work. That doesn't feel like it works.
Right.
And then Hannah would be, and I would be like, that doesn't feel like it works. And she would be like, yeah, but I think it might. Like, just wait because it doesn't work right now.
Right.
And a lot of times she was right. It's like, and then certain things that worked in one rehearsal, I think this is the thing I learned as a performer. And I learned this in UCB too. It's helpful with comedy because it either makes people laugh or it doesn't.
Right.
But it was so interesting because sometimes, because of the mood of one rehearsal or something, an actor would try something and it would work so well. It would be like a brilliant, wonderful move, just happened in the moment. And then because they got a good reaction of it one rehearsal, they would bring it back again and it just would fall
Doesn't play
flat.
the same.
Yeah. And for comedy, what's nice is like you can have a moment in a show that's a little bit different and you can get a huge laugh and you feel on top of the world, and then you try to bring that moment back the next night and you realize like, what, this audience doesn't like that moment. And it's like a lot of times it's because like this moment wasn't organic tonight. It wasn't lived in the same way. It wasn't the mood of the show wasn't the same.
Right.
And so when you're forcing it, the audience can tell, and it's like doesn't work anymore. And so it was interesting to see those moments where it was like that was a really fun rehearsal moment, but then sometimes you had to be like, yeah, but you got to get rid of it.
Right.
Even though that was brilliant when you did it, but now you got to get rid of it.
It worked once, but it won't necessarily work on a continuing basis.
Right.
So you were in the rehearsal room as assistant director for Hannah. You saw this whole rehearsal process. You did all this work around the rehearsal process that a lot of times actors aren't aware of. We then moved into the run of the show, and you moved into the booth and were calling and running the show every night. How was that experience in and of itself? And was there anything difficult, interesting? Do you have any thoughts about moving from sort of being the assistant director in the room to all of a sudden being the person who makes the show happen every night?
Yeah. It was so nerve-wracking. It's funny because I think the first few shows especially, it's with our show, the cues were so important. The sound and lighting cues were so important.
There's a lot of technical elements.
Yeah, to like what was happening. And the most important ones were the most dramatic moments of the show. I mean, every single night, it was Juliet taking her vial, and there's a transition into the next scene.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sound cue for when she drinks the vial. And then, well, first there's a lighting cue that's like a slow fade that ends up like creating a spotlight on Juliet. And I mean, I think it looked great. It looked fantastic. And Mick did a fantastic job in that role, which made it so nerve-wracking for me because I was like, if I mess this up, like the audience is going to be so angry because I would completely ruin this dramatic moment, that is so pivotal to the story. And so it was moments like that just I was just like, my heart was racing and my palms were sweating and all of that, especially for the first couple nights. And then there were other moments where it was less of a big deal, and there were certain things where I did make mistakes.
Of course.
But luckily it was like generally in scenes where there was like a lot of action happening on stage, and so it was less noticeable. I'm sure people noticed still, but it's one of those things where like lighting and sound is best when you don't notice them, right? So,
right. Yeah.
But I came out of it. I mean, I've always had profound respect for lighting designers, sound designers, people who run shows.
Mm-hmm.
But especially after I've done it, it's like, this is tough.
Right.
And it is, and they deserve a lot of money for it, and they deserve a lot of praise, and I don't think they get enough. But it is one of those things that I'm appreciative of it. I felt very proud of myself.
As well you should have.
To do it, just because I was so nervous about it. But I don't think I never messed up that Juliet drinking thing, and I never messed up the Romeo killing himself. So I was very happy about that. And
the big moments.
Yeah, spoiler alert for those
right,
of you.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned mistakes you made, because, I mean, during the entire run of the show, I don't know that I noticed any technical elements that went wrong. I mean, I was also on stage, so I wouldn't necessarily have the high level, this is everything that should be happening at all times. But it's mostly super impressive that you took this job on so well, because at the beginning of the project, you didn't know that you were going to be running the show.
I had no
that
idea.
was something that mostly I just sort of sprung on you, that welcome, you've got this whole other job you have to do now.
Well, I mean, it was, I'm very thankful for it. And it was really cool to be there every night to see the show and how it evolved, and, really brilliant performances throughout the show. And so it was really cool, and also just very interesting to see why one performance was different from the next and all of that. Because I don't think you can't see it in the same way as an actor.
Yeah.
You can feel it, and I think performers often say like, oh, this audience doesn't like us or whatever. But like from the booth, it's like, a lot of times it's like, no, they still like you. They might not be as responsive, but they still like you.
Right.
Or
it still reads.
Yeah. Or like, they don't like you and you're not doing great or
right.
whatever,
Go do better.
Yeah, kind of. But most of the time it was like, the audience is still on your side, even if you're not getting exactly what you want from them. It's like,
right.
Most of the time people are still smiling. People are still like having a good time. And
they're in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I guess we can't demand too much of an audience in terms of response specifically. So we just have a few minutes left here. I've got a couple of just sort of extra time questions that are apropos of nothing. Do you have, or can you in this moment come up with a 5-year plan for yourself and a 10-year plan for yourself that you can just quickly sketch out for us? What might that look like?
Sure. It's funny. It's like a job interview.
Yeah, right.
5 years at this place? No. That's how I always felt with every job interview. I was like, what do you see yourself in 5 years? Not here.
Somewhere else. Yeah.
Somewhere else.
Working somewhere else and happy.
Hell away from you. But I think in 5 years, as an artist, I would really like to be, I would like to be better, first of all, everything. I think.
I mean, that's an important thing to know about. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, just growth-wise, and I think I would really like to have, within the next 5 years, really created at least one project that is completely something that's like, when it started and where it ends is like mine. Something that I can be like, I'm either telling a part of my story or I am, intimately involved with something, and I will always be thankful and need a team around me. And
of course.
It'll be, and I'm thankful for anybody that would help me. But I think within the next 5 years, I would like one project that I can be like, this is like my, I don't know. There's a lot to put on it, but with Sylvester Stallone when he wrote Rocky, it's like that was his project, and it's a Best Picture winner, but it's like, so
that could be your project.
I mean, that would be amazing. I'm not expecting that, but I will say that's like, even if it's something that only 3 people see, I think it would be great to have a project that's like, I did that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's I think I love kind of how broad that is. Like you don't have this specific, this needs to happen in the next 5 years, but yeah, it's always, especially knowing where we are now with Mad Company and with ourselves, like we are creating our own work and we understand the need to put ourselves out there under sort of our own creative control. So I think that's ideal to have that for a goal for the next 5 years.
Well, maybe I'm purposely vague because otherwise I have to
committing yourself to something.
in 5 years you're gonna have me back on the podcast and be like, where was that short film or where was that stand-up set that you always wanted to do?
That's right. We're gonna roll clip from this.
Yeah.
And then just in the last couple minutes, briefly, I've asked this of all of the guests so far, which have been exactly 2 people. If you weren't an actor / comic / creative, what would you be? What would you be doing?
Ooh. There's a big part of me, I think. A friend of mine was an actor and he was a dog trainer. And I was like, as well. Yeah. He was always
it's 2 separate things.
Yeah, he was always torn between like being an actor or being a dog trainer. And I think I would love like to be a dog trainer. Like I think that would be really fun. I think I mean I love animals, specifically dogs.
Sure.
And yeah, if I could, you know, like in a different life, my family's all in Montana. So if I could like be in Montana on a huge ranch with a bunch of, you know, like 10 dogs that are all like expertly trained.
Right.
And then people would come and be like, oh my dog's having this issue, and I could take like an aggressive dog and make it like a perfect family dog. Or I have I mean that's I once again high hopes for myself in this other career as well. But
right.
But I think like that would be a very fulfilling life. I think so.
That sounds beautiful,
Yeah.
bucolic and lovely. Well, with that, Max Brand, thank you so much for joining us here on One Hale of a Conversation.
I had a hail of a time, I'll tell you that much.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you. We'll have you back at some point in the future because my roster of future guests is pretty short, so you'll be back. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.